Dust rolled across the open plains as the sun bled orange over the jagged silhouette of Devil's Backbone Ridge, and in that lonely stretch of Wyoming prairie where even the wind forgot to howl, Jed Caldwell sat slumped outside his crooked barn, sipping the last of his corn liquor, alone, staring at the dying sky with the kind of emptiness that doesn't come from hunger or thirst but from a hole inside the soul carved out by years of silence, loss, and something far deeper, a yearning that didn't quite have a name, but burned nonetheless. It had been 4 winters since Martha died, taken too quickly by the fever, leaving Jed with nothing but a sagging roof, 3 rusting horseshoes nailed above a door that no longer stayed shut, and a heart heavy enough to drown a man in a puddle. And while the world moved in cattle drives, auctions, Sunday sermons, and barroom brawls, Jed remained still, a ghost in his own life, and the townsfolk, though kind in passing, avoided him now, whispering when his name came up, saying things like too young to look that old, or a man can't be alone forever without something coming for him, and they weren't entirely wrong, for something had come, something that had watched him longer than he dared to imagine. Something older than the bones buried in the ridge and darker than the cellar of any man's heart, and its name, if it had one, had long been forgotten, but the shape it wore now was known across the plains as the Widow, the Giant Widow, though none dared call her that to her face, for she rarely spoke and never visited twice, standing taller than any man Jed had ever seen, at least 7 feet, her frame shrouded in layered black that shimmered like beetle shell under moonlight, and her eyes, those eyes, pale as glass and yet glowing with a depth that made even the boldest ranch hand avert his gaze, had met Jed's once in the town square when he'd gone to trade his last 2 goats for oil and oats, and in that instant, as time seemed to twist and the air grew thick, Jed had felt something cold and electric travel down his spine, like lightning in reverse, and from that moment he knew that the Widow had taken interest in him, though for what purpose he could not say. And he prayed nightly that it would pass, that it was some strange dream, the result of drink or despair. But then the signs began, subtle at first. A barn door unlatched in the night, though the hinges groaned and the latch had never failed. Massive hoof prints near the well, though no beast Jed knew had feet that size. A feather, a black, thick, warm to the touch, resting on his pillow one morning, though every door had been locked. And then came the knock. Just past midnight on the 13th day of October, a thud so deep it shook the lantern off its hook, and Jed, half drunk and half afraid, grabbed his rifle and swung open the door, only to freeze where he stood, for there she was, the Widow, her head bowed to fit the frame, her skin moonlit silver, her breath not misting like a human's would in the cold, and her dress, alive with shadows, moved though the wind had died, and when she spoke, it was not with a voice but with a presence, a silk-slick current that flowed into his ears and straight down to the pit of his gut, and she said, "You're dying from silence, Jed Caldwell," and her hand, smooth and impossibly long-fingered, ran down the side of his unshaven cheek, not cold, not warm, but right, and Jed wanted to scream, to run, to slam the door and beg for salvation, but he stood there, frozen in some spell, his lips moving before his brain caught up, stammering, "What do you want?" And the Widow smiled, the kind of smile that speaks of inevitability, and said, "By winter, I'll have your daughter growing inside me," and the words, though soft, struck like thunder, rattling his bones with something ancient and undeniable, and Jed, confused, muttered, "What daughter?" And she leaned in, her eyes reflecting stars he couldn't see, and said, "The one that hasn't been born yet." Hours, before turning and vanishing into the night, not walking, not floating, just disappearing, as if she'd never been, and Jed stood there long after, rifle clutched to his chest, the cold biting harder now, not just against his skin but inside him, in the very marrow of his bones, and that night he didn't sleep, didn't blink, just sat on his porch as the hours bled away, heart racing and mind screaming, trying to tell himself it was the drink, the grief, the isolation, but when morning came, the air still felt wrong, the earth quieter than usual, and when he went to feed the cattle, he found one of his cows, Abessia, dead, cleanly stripped to the bone as though devoured by fire and sore time itself, and beside her, etched into the dirt with fingers or claws, were the words, "Don't be afraid. She will be beautiful." And that was when Jed knew this wasn't a dream or madness, this was real, and something had been set in motion, something he could neither stop nor understand, and yet, he didn't tell anyone, didn't ride into town to scream his truth, because deep down, a part of him is some terrible, aching, forgotten part of wanted to see where this would go, because for the first time in years, something had chosen him, and though it filled him with dread, it also filled the silence. And so, days later, against every instinct, he saddled his horse and rode toward Devil's Backbone Ridge, past the creaking trees and howling stones, and found her, the widow, standing atop a throne of skulls, some animal, some not, her dress billowing though the air was still, and her eyes, like portals to winter, watched him with a patience that made his blood run cold, and he opened his mouth to ask her what this was, what she wanted, what it meant. But she silenced him with a finger pressed to his lips and said, "You came because you're tired of being empty," and she wasn't wrong, and though every shred of logic begged him to turn and run, Jed stepped forward, drawn by something older than love, older than lust, something primal and dark, and when she touched him again, the world spun, and all the loneliness that had carved holes in his soul began to fill with something vast and terrible and warm. And he couldn't remember what happened after the sky folded, time snapped, and he awoke by his barn 3 days later, unharmed, unchanged, except for the dreams of lullabies and children's laughter, of golden-haired girls with his eyes and her smile, of a home no longer broken, but buzzing with life and light and something strange. And then came the signs of the trees bore fruit again. The soil grew green, his joints stopped aching. And the townsfolk began to whisper once more, not about his grief, but about the widow, and how her shadow had been seen dancing across his roof by moonlight. And Jed didn't answer their stares, didn't care for their words, because something had awakened, and though he didn't yet know the cost, he had made a vow in the dark to see this through, whatever this was, even if it meant facing something the world would never understand. The days following Jed's visit to the widow's throne were unlike anything he had ever known, a strange, dreamlike, a woven tapestry of reality and illusion where each moment bled into the next like oil spreading through water, and though the sun still rose and the moon still crossed the sky, something had shifted, something had entered him, and the world he returned to wasn't quite the same as the one he had left. His farm, which had once stood like a dying limb on the edge of a forgotten plain, began to bloom with unseasonal life. Yellow wildflowers burst through cracks in the hardened soil, the trees which had for years stood bare and fruitless suddenly hung heavy with pears and apples, and a sweet, thick scent of honeydew filled the air though no bees had been seen in that region for decades, and Jed, once a man half consumed by grief and emptiness, began to feel full of questions, full of memory, full of something stirring within his bones like thunder and distant mountains. And the strangest part of all was how little he resisted it now. At first, he thought he was going mad. He would wake in the middle of the night covered in sweat, eyes wide, heart racing, and the echo of lullabies lingering in his ears, lullabies he didn't know, sung in a voice not his own but oddly familiar, a voice warm and ancient, and in those dreams, he saw a girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with golden curls that danced even without wind, skin like polished porcelain, and eyes that held his pain, his rage, his hope, but also something far older, something that shimmered like the stars beyond stars, and she would reach for him and giggle, "Daddy," and vanish just before he could touch her hand, and each morning he would rise from his bed with tears on his face and dirt on his boots as though he had been walking all night in fields that no longer existed. The town folk noticed the changes too, how his limp was gone, how his beard was trimmed and clean, how he smiled now. Not often but enough to stir whispers in the saloon and at the chapel where the preacher had once said Jed's soul was waiting to be buried, and they noticed something else too, something far more troubling, how the widow's shadow had begun appearing near his property more often, how people who rode close to Devil's Backbone would hear laughter echoing from the ridge, and how those who dared mock Jed or bring up Martha's name with scorn found strange scratches on their windows, or woke to find all their mirrors shattered from within, and so they kept their distance, choosing gossip over confrontation, and Jed welcomed their silence, because deep inside he had come to understand something profound and terrifying. The vow the widow had made was not a metaphor or madness, it was a prophecy unfolding with each tick of the clock, with each breath of the wind, with each beat of his steadying heart. And the confirmation came on a cloudy November morning when he stepped out of his home to find her standing there. The widow, not on his porch this time but beneath the old sycamore near the well, dressed in layers of gray that danced like fog, her face softer now, her height no less imposing but her presence warmer, rounder. And then he saw Ida, her hands resting over her midsection, the fabric stretching slightly around a belly that had not been like that weeks ago. And though Jed had never seen her eat or sleep or even blink, she looked a broken bar human, and she met his gaze not with cold command but with a strange, tender pride, and she spoke, her voice still silk and smoke but gentler, like fire under snow, and said, "She's growing fast, Jed, because she knows time has no patience here." And Jed, lips dry, whispered, "How is this possible?" And the widow smiled, and not cruelly but with a knowing sadness, and said, "Because we are not bound by what is or was, only what must be." And then she took his hand, calloused and trembling, and placed it against her womb. And what he felt beneath that thin layer of fabric would haunt him forever, not a kick or a flutter but a pulse, steady and powerful, like the beat of a second heart in rhythm with his own. And in that moment Jed saw a flicker of something, impossibly a vision, perhaps of a girl with wings made of shadow and flame, skipping through a burning field while birds bowed to her as she passed. And when he gasped and pulled away, the widow only nodded and said, "She will be yours, and she will be more," and vanished again, leaving him breathless and bent on the ground, clutching his chest not from pain but from awe. After that, time grew thin, like paper stretched too tight, and each day felt like a crack in the dam. Every moment a whisper of what was coming. A snow began to fall early that year, white and heavy, and with it came strange dreams, not only to Jed but to others in town. The preacher dreamed of flames licking the chapel pews, the blacksmith awoke with burn marks on his hands. And children spoke of a girl with silver eyes who asked them riddles in the night and vanished before dawn, and the town began to murmur about Jed's deal, some claiming he'd summoned a spirit to replace his dead wife, others whispering about witches, devils, and ancient curses, but none dared confront him, not after the sheriff rode up to question him and came back mute, eyes blank, mouth stitched closed by silence itself. And as the days bled into weeks and the snow rose higher, Jed's home became something else, a warmer, almost golden, despite the cold, and at night, lights flickered from within like hearths dancing behind every wall. And one evening, as Jed stood by the frozen lake near his property, he saw his reflection, and beside him, the girl again, no longer a dream, no longer imagined, standing on the ice barefoot, smiling, and though the wind howled and the cold bit at his skin, she was untouched, pristine, and she whispered, "Soon," before fading into the wind like smoke, and Jed whispered back, "I'll be ready," though he wasn't sure if he lied. Then came the storm, the one the old-timers would speak of for years, of the blizzard that swallowed horses whole, buried cabins to the roofline, and made compasses spin like broken toys. And it was on the first night of that storm, as thunder cracked across the sky and lightning danced between the trees, that the widow returned for the final time, this time not alone, not speaking, but glowing, her body radiant, her belly swollen to a size that seemed unnatural, impossible, and yet sacred. And she moved through the snow like a shadow over water, entering Jed's barn without touching the doors, and Jed followed, not with fear but reverence, because he knew, he understood, that this was not birth as mortals knew it but a becoming. And as he stepped inside, the walls of the barn shimmered with symbols, the air smelled of wild orchids and blood, and the animals stood silent, unmoving, as if they too were witnesses to something beyond time. And the widow lay upon the hay, not with pain but with purpose, singing in a tongue older than stone, her voice layered with echoes of women long dead and stars long gone. And there was no blood, no scream, no sweat, only light, and silence, and then a cry, soft and sharp, like crystal breaking, and there she was, the girl, not wailing but watching, her eyes wide and ancient, her skin flawless, her presence undeniable, and Jed, trembling, reached for her, and when their hands touched, the storm outside stopped, not faded but ceased, as though the world itself paused to breathe, and the widow, now pale and translucent, smiled and whispered, "Now the silence is gone," before fading, her form dissolving into wind and dust, leaving only the child and Jed behind. And in that moment he knew he was no longer alone, that the promise had been fulfilled, and as he cradled the child in his arms, he felt the full weight of destiny settle over his shoulders, not crushing but grounding, anchoring him to a path he could not change. And so he stayed there, rocking her gently, whispering stories of meadows and rivers and horses and sky, and outside the snow fell again, softer now, gentler, as though even the heavens dared not disturb the bond now formed in the months and years that followed. Jed was never seen in town again, and those few who dared ride near his homestead reported strange sights: a girl dancing atop frozen lakes without leaving footprints, trees bowing as she passed, shadows following her even at noon, and those who mocked her vanished or found their homes turned upside down overnight. And some say she was a blessing, others a curse, but all agreed on one thing: Devil's Backbone was no longer a place for men, and whatever lived there now was beyond understanding, a force wrapped in innocence and fire, and those who listened closely at night could sometimes hear a lullaby on the wind, sung by a voice that remembered pain, and rage, and love. And in that song was the story of a lonely cowboy, a giant widow, and a daughter born of silence and storm.